All right, well, I think we've plateaued in terms of arrivals, so I'd like to welcome you all to this week's UCCS Speaker Series. I'm Richard Kravitz, Director of UCCS, and as we do now almost every week, we're pleased to bring you one of our continuing series of talks on policy, and in this case, politics. This week, we're particularly pleased to have the Chancellor's Professor of Law and Political Science at UC Irvine, Professor Rick Hasen. Professor Hasen teaches on election law, campaign financing, politics, and policy. He received his undergraduate degree from UC Berkeley and a law degree from UCLA. He was rated as one of the 100 most influential lawyers in America in 2013 by the National Law Journal, and as all of us know, there are a lot of influential lawyers in America, so that is quite a distinction. And he's the author of multiple books, including Plutocrats United, published in 2016, and his latest, Election Meltdown, Dirty Tricks, Distrust, and the Threat to American Democracy, which is related in many ways to today's talk, which specifically addresses, can American democracy survive the 2020 elections? So without further ado, it's a great pleasure to introduce Professor Rick Hasen.
Thanks, thank you so much. And it's really great to be with all of you. I was hoping that we could do this in person, but I'm at least glad that I can speak to you virtually today. And I know that we're going to reserve the last about 15 minutes for questions. So as I'm speaking, please, if you have questions, please think about those, and we will be taking them at the end. So this talk is called, Can American Democracy Survive the 2020 Elections? And it is based on my new book, which came out in early February, called Election Meltdown. And when I wrote that book, I thought we were going to have quite a contested presidential election season. And this was all before COVID-19 hit. And I'm now even more worried about whether people will have confidence in the results of the election, whether it will be seen as legitimate, not just by the winners of the election, but those who are on the losing side. And so I'm going to talk about the themes of my book. And then in the last part of my talk, before we get to the questions, I'm going to turn to how specifically the coronavirus is going to potentially affect the election, and more specifically affect Americans' confidence in the fairness of the election. But I think in order to get to that point, it's important to put everything in context. And so I want to talk about that context. Just to begin, I've been tracking election issues and election law issues for 2.5 decades. And I recall a moment when in January 2009, Barack Obama was sworn in as president. And I remarked on my website, Election Law Blog, how remarkable it was that here we went from a conservative president, a Republican, George W. Bush, handing over power peacefully to a liberal Democratic president, Barack Obama. And this was not seen as a moment of trepidation for the country. This was seen as, the way politics works is when you lose your election or when your term is up, you peacefully give up power, and we have a peaceful transition of power, right? It was a moment of celebration. And I was struck by how far away from that the country came not that many years, less than a decade after that peaceful transition of power. And there was a moment, if we had video capacity, I would show you this video. This was a speech that Donald Trump was giving as a candidate at one of his pre-election rallies. And it came a day or so after the question came up about will you accept the results of the election? And in this video from this rally, Donald Trump remarked that he would 100% accept the results of the election. And then he paused, looked at the camera, smiled, and pointed and said, "If I win." And it was really kind of a remarkable moment in, I think, this transition from a time when we did not really question whether there would be peaceful transitions of power, whether losers would accept election results, to this moment now. Even back in 2000, when we had the disputed election between Bush and Gore that led to the famous Supreme Court decision, once the Supreme Court decided the case, Gore the next morning conceded, and there was no question that Democrats were certainly unhappy, but there was no question about who was going to be the next president. And so in Election Meltdown, what I try to do is situate this shift. We see in polling about 40% or more of the country saying that they're not confident the election is going to be fairly run. They're worried about interference. They're worried about fraud. They're worried about voter suppression. And so Election Meltdown traces the 4 reasons why we have seen this decline in voter confidence and what we can do about it. And so I'm going to walk through those, but I just wanted to start by talking about the issue of voter fraud. I'm going to delve back into it in a few minutes, but I want to point out that this is a kind of issue that has now come to the forefront with the election of Trump. So here is a tweet that Trump put out. This is a tweet where he is talking about mail-in voting. This is just from a few weeks ago, and Trump is claiming that there's a tremendous potential for voter fraud in mail-in voting, which is a new claim of his. He's clamored about voter fraud for quite some time, but this transition to mail-in voting is new, and I'm going to come back and talk about that later. But I think it kind of frames the discussion in thinking about whether the election can be conducted successfully and legitimately when you have the president and a major presidential candidate suggesting that mail-in ballots, which are no doubt going to increase in the 2020 election, whether or not those ballots are valid or whether they are fraud. So that kind of sets some of the stage for today. But I want to be clear that my book is not about Donald Trump, and the problems in our elections extend well beyond Donald Trump. And so just to give you another example of something I'm going to come back and talk about soon, Stacey Abrams, who's a very nationally recognized figure right now, she ran for governor in Georgia, and there's a dispute in Georgia. I'm going to talk a little bit more about that. Brian Kemp was declared the winner of that election. Stacey Abrams was not. At one point, because she felt the election was run unfairly, you'll see at the bottom of the slide, she did say that she won her election. And so talk about rigged or stolen elections is something that we see on both sides. And the rhetoric has really ratcheted up. And so here is Ken Paxton, who is he's the Attorney General of Texas, talking about what he calls a voter fraud alert, says that 58,000 non-citizens voted in Texas elections. He made this claim right after the Texas election officials had released a list claiming that there were up to 95,000 people on Texas voter rolls who were not eligible to vote. To cut ahead a few months, that report was based on completely fallacious data. They matched voter registration records with old citizenship records in the interim period between the time that the data was from and the current day. About 1 million people became citizens living in Texas, and it turned out that there was no evidence of non-citizens voting in Texas. This tweet is still up. It has never been removed. The only thing that's happened is that Texas has had to pay hundreds of thousands of dollars in attorney's fees when they were sued for making these false claims and trying to remove eligible voters from the voting rolls. So this is a serious problem that has real-world ramifications. And so I'm going to, as I said, talk about the 4 reasons for Americans' increasing mistrust in the fairness and accuracy of our election system. And the first that I put on this list is the fight over voter fraud and voter suppression. And we hear it all the time, some Republicans making claims that you need to have strict rules to prevent voter fraud because voter fraud is rampant. And you have Democrats claiming that these rules are being put in place not to prevent fraud or promote voter confidence, but instead to suppress the vote. In the book, Election Meltdown, I start by this section by talking about a case which I consider to be so far the most important voting case of the 21st century, the most important voting trial, I should say, of the 21st century so far. It's a case probably very few of you have heard about, hasn't gotten a lot of attention, but so let me explain why it's important. So for years, there have been a number of conservative thinkers and politicians who've made the claim that voter fraud in the United States is rampant. And one of the most prominent of these people is a person named Chris Kobach. Chris Kobach was the Secretary of State of Kansas. He is now running for governor of Kansas. He's been talked about as someone who could serve in the Trump administration, potentially at the Department of Homeland Security. His two big issues are voter fraud and illegal immigration. These are his two signature issues. And these two things came together when Kobach was able to get the state of Kansas to pass a law that required people to provide documentary proof of citizenship, like a birth certificate or a naturalization certificate, if they want to be able to register to vote in Kansas, right? So this is not a voter ID law. This is not, you have to show your driver's license or something every time you vote. This is a law about voter registration. And Kobach claimed that this law was necessary in order to prevent non-citizens from voting. We know this law, unlike voter ID laws where there's less good social science evidence of their effects, we know this law had caused 30,000 people in Kansas to not be able to register to vote. They were put on what was called the suspension list. And eventually the ACLU sued and argued that this law violated, the state law violated federal law. And the issue is complicated, the interplay between federal rules on voter registration and state rules, the interaction between the state rules and the US Constitution. But at the trial that took place in this case called Fish versus Kobach, which challenged this provision of Kansas law, at this trial, one of the things that the Kansas team had to do was to prove that non-citizen voting was a major problem in Kansas. The reason this case is so significant is that it was really the first time that the question of the extent of voter fraud was really put to trial, where one of the biggest proponents of this issue was able to control the trial. Chris Kobach not only was Secretary of State, he's an attorney, he was a law professor, he decided to try the case himself. So he was the lead attorney on this case. So here was his chance. And Kobach was famous for saying that the amount of non-citizen voting they found, only a handful of cases in Kansas, was the tip of the iceberg. This was his saying, here was his chance to try to prove that voter fraud was a major problem in Kansas. Non-citizens were voting at large rates. And just to cut to the chase, he was not successful. The judge found that there was no iceberg, she wrote. This judge, fourth generation Kansan, first African-American woman judge on this Kansas federal court. She wrote, there was no iceberg. There was only an icicle made up of mostly administrative error, like the people who were mistakenly coded as having been born in the 1800s. So at the trial, Kobach tried to prove that this was a big problem. He brought in a social scientist who presented evidence from a study from data he had taken from a large study called the Cooperative Congressional Election Study, from which he extrapolated that 30,000 non-citizens were on the voting rolls in Kansas. This study was seen as so poor in terms of its design that 200 political scientists signed a letter saying that the study should not be relied upon. And so then this social scientist created another study, which for the purpose of the litigation, and this is actually what I open the book with. He took those 30,000 people who were on the list of suspended voters whose registrations were suspended because they hadn't shown their papers, they hadn't provided their birth certificate or naturalization certificate. He looked at those 30,000 people, and he and a graduate assistant decided to code the names on the list as foreign or non-foreign. And so here was the cross-examination of this expert, Dr. Richman, by Dale Ho, who was the ACLU's lead attorney. Just hypothetically, Dr. Richman, if you came across the name Carlos Murguia, would you code that as foreign or non-foreign? I'm sorry, could you please spell the name? Sure, and then he spells the name. Probably. Probably what? Probably I would code it as foreign. Okay, are you aware that Carlos Murguia is a United States District Court judge who sits in this courthouse? I am not. I mean, this was the level of evidence that was put forward to try to show that voter fraud was a major problem. Here was the chance to show it. Not only did Kobach lose this case in the district court, he was sanctioned by the court, first for misleading the ACLU about the contents of a document he had provided to President Trump about voter registration, and also for his poor understanding of the rules of evidence. Here was a former law professor who was sanctioned that he had to take a continuing legal education course. He took it online and had the state of Kansas pay for that. But it was really the big chance to show that voter suppression is a major problem. Now, how does this, that voter fraud was a major problem. So how does this tie into voter confidence? And what do we take from this lack of social science evidence about all of this? Well, what I think has happened is that these efforts to make it harder for people to register and to vote in the name of preventing voter fraud have convinced both Democrats and Republicans that the other side is trying to cheat. Republicans believe that Democrats are engaged in massive voter fraud. It's a message they hear all the time, including from the president. Democrats, seeing evidence there is no widespread voter fraud, believe that there are efforts to widely suppress the vote. And both sides believe the other side is cheating. Now, much of the social science evidence about the suppressive effects of these laws shows that not all of these laws have a suppressive effect. I'd point you to the recent Wisconsin primary, where the Republican legislature refused to extend the date of the primary or to extend the dates for the receipt of absentee ballots in the middle of the pandemic. And yet turnout was up among Democrats. That doesn't prove that the law was not suppressive, but it proves that sometimes there's a backlash and people make extra efforts in order to vote. But the real question should be, why are you putting additional hurdles in front of voters that are not serving any important purpose, like actually preventing fraud? So one of the four reasons why I think we have this problem is in lack of voter confidence is this fight over voter fraud and voter suppression. But it's far from the only problem. Another major problem that we have with our elections is that although I'd say most election administrators do a very good job, maybe 95% of election administrators do a very good job in this country, there are pockets of election administrators who are incompetent. I call this the weakest link axiom of election administration. If there's a very close election, the attention's not going to be put on the 95% of election administrators who are doing a very good job. It's going to be put on the 5% or fewer who are doing a bad job. And I highlight the work of an election administrator named Brenda Snipes, who was running elections in Broward County, Florida. She had a history of poor election administration from, in one election, failing to mail absentee ballots to 58,000 voters in her county that requested them. In another election, leaving a medical marijuana initiative completely off the ballot for some voters. And in the 2018 election, there was a very close race for the United States Senate between the incumbent Florida U.S. Senator Bill Nelson and the then leaving the governorship, Rick Scott, who was running as the Republican against him. Very close race. It came down to a recount. Every jurisdiction, every county in Florida had to conduct the recount and within a certain time frame. And Broward County was actually able to finish the recount in time, but the person who was running the website to send Broward's votes to the state election officials in time didn't know what he was doing, and the results were 2 minutes late and they were not counted. In the end, the county board in Broward County thought that the recount results that were in were so poorly done that they voted to send in the original votes rather than the recounted votes because 2,000 votes were somehow missing. And Brenda Snipes took no responsibility. And you see the quote here to the left: an election like the one we just finished almost always has so many moving parts, many components. I'm pleased we were able to accomplish what we did in the period of time that was available. And so what happens when there is a close election is that the focus goes to these weakest links. One of the things that we saw, it wasn't just that Snipes wasn't running her office properly, even the ballot design was poorly done. You can see, if you look, this is the actual ballot that was used in Broward County. If you look in the first column on the left under the instructions, there you'll see the race between Rick Scott and Bill Nelson. And there were thousands of voters who skipped that race because they did not even know that the race was listed down there. There are all kinds of scientific studies about how you should design ballots so voters know what they're supposed to do. This is very poor ballot design. And this alone might have cost Bill Nelson the race because there were many undervotes in this race, many people who voted a ballot but didn't vote in this race at all. And Broward, heavily Democratic county, there were more votes for Nelson. Maybe he would have gotten even more if the ballot had been designed better. But there was this whole fight about this recount, and even early on, Trump weighed in and basically accused, he called Brenda Snipes a woman with a horrible history and accused her of committing fraud. And I like to use Occam's razor, I should say Hanlon's razor in this context, which is this computer science maxim that says, don't attribute to malice that which can be explained by incompetence. It's very easy when you see poor election administration to assume that there is an intent to commit fraud, but in fact, what happens often in these cases is that you just have these pockets of incompetence. But it provides a basis on which, if you don't like the results of the election, you can seek to undermine it by pointing to evidence of fraud. Brenda Snipes is a Democrat. There are lots of Democrats that run elections in big cities. This tends to be a focus of Republican claims of fraud, but sometimes these claims of incompetence come from Democrats against Republicans. So here's the website of the then Georgia Secretary of State, now Governor Brian Kemp. He's the one that was running against Stacey Abrams for governor in Georgia in 2018. And this is what voters who were voting a few days before the November 6, 2018 election on November 4th, or November 3rd, the November 4th, the Sunday before the election, you see under news and announcements, this is what any Georgia voter would see if they went to this page to try to find out where they're supposed to vote or anything like that. You see that Kemp accused Democrats of trying to hack into state voter registration databases and said that there was going to be an investigation into this group. It turns out that the Democrats did not try to break in, but a voter who was not working with the Democratic Party, who has a background in software engineering, went to check his voter registration information on the state database, which for years had been criticized for having security holes. There had been lawsuits over it. He discovered that with changing a few keystrokes, he could view all the files on the website. He called the Democrats' election protection hotline. They called some computer scientists at Georgia Tech to find out if it was legit. The Georgia Tech computer scientists called a national security agency. The Secretary of State was contacted. Next thing you know, the Democrats were accused of having committed fraud. And months later, we found out Democrats did nothing wrong. The state quietly fixed the hole, and Kemp was able to accuse the Democrats on the eve of the election of committing fraud or committing some kind of computer crime, when in fact there was no evidence of that. There was only evidence of his incompetence in running the voter registration page. So this further undermines people's confidence. The third pocket of problems, or the third area of problems where I think we see this decline in confidence in election results are dirty tricks. And so we're all familiar with what happened in 2016 with elements of the Russian government engaging in a number of dirty tricks, including using social media to try to depress turnout among African Americans, trying to rile Americans up against each other, breaking into and stealing emails from Democratic officials and then leaking them through WikiLeaks and other means, as well as probing the voter registration databases of all 50 states. No votes were changed, but there was evidence that they were going in there. That can only undermine people's confidence in the process. But they're not the only ones who've engaged in dirty tricks. And so one thing that happened that was interesting example of Democratic dirty tricks occurred in 2017. You may remember that when Jeff Sessions became the Attorney General of the United States, he vacated his office as the United States Senator from Alabama. There was a new race to replace him. This was between Doug Jones, the Democrat, who ends up going on to win, and Roy Moore, the controversial former judge, running as the Republican. In that race, what we saw was a group supporting Jones, but not working with Jones, engaged in an effort to try to suppress the votes of moderate Republicans in the state. This is, page you see here is a secret report that was leaked of how they targeted Alabama voters to try to suppress the vote. Here's one example that the New York Times wrote about, a fake page called Dry Alabama, which was supposedly a bunch of fundamentalist Baptist Republicans who supported Roy Moore and wanted the state to ban all sales of alcohol. The idea was they'd come out and say they loved Roy Moore. This was not intended to get votes for Roy Moore, but intended to make moderate Republicans decide to stay home or vote for Jones. It's not clear how much of an effect this actually had, but it certainly was intended to affect the vote in the state. As I mentioned a few minutes ago, the targeting of African-American voters in particular by the Russian government in 2016 shows that these efforts might be targeted at particular populations, and that social media, thanks to micro-targeting where you can send ads to particular places, you can really try to figure out whether it's a group of people who might have same backgrounds or might have same political views or might live in the same geographic area. You can target. Here's another example of targeting. This was on more right-wing sites trying to make the claim that non-citizens are voting. And these messages that the Russians were putting out really echoed the kind of things that Trump and others were saying. Last example of dirty tricks I'll point to two. One is there was actual ballot tampering with absentee ballots in North Carolina. This was in the 2018 race for the United States Congressional District in North Carolina's 9th district. The ballot tampering was so bad that the Board of Elections on a bipartisan basis had to call for a new election, and they had to redo the election. Then there are also concerns about, and I write about this a lot in the book Election Meltdown, concerns that the American electrical grid could be hacked. Imagine if there was a hack to try to bring down the power in a Democratic city in a swing state like Philadelphia or Detroit or Milwaukee on election day. That's something that has worried me. And then the last of the four reasons I think that confidence is declining is that you have, as I opened up with, lots of incendiary rhetoric about rigged or stolen elections. Here's another example from Trump. And here's Stacey Abrams. I would show you this video if we had the capability of Stacey Abrams refusing to call Kemp the legitimate governor of Georgia because of a number of steps he had taken to try to make it harder for people to register and vote in that state. So lots of talk about rigged or stolen elections reinforces people's concerns. And I pointed out that we shouldn't do this. It was my moment of being attacked by Alec Baldwin for doing this. So that was a change of pace for me. So these are the kinds of things I worried about in Election Meltdown. And then after I talk about this, I'm going to turn to COVID-19 in particular and how that will affect things. What if Trump at first appears to win election, but as more votes are counted, Democrats take the lead in key swing states? I'm going to come back to that one in a minute. What if Trump wins, but Democrats believe that voter suppression in Georgia or Florida was responsible? Or what about that hacked power outage? And my concern is that we don't have good answers to these questions. We don't have good procedures in place for how we're going to deal with this. Now, let me talk about COVID-19 in the election and how it exacerbates some of the things I've been talking about. So the first issue, and was that tweet that I pointed out at the very beginning, the tweet from President Trump from just a couple of weeks ago, where he says that vote by mail is infected with fraud. This is a new claim. Although some of the people who've claimed that voter fraud is a major problem have pointed to instances of absentee ballot fraud, they never used it to claim that there should be less vote by mail. Vote by mail had traditionally been used more by Republicans. It hadn't been the topic. Instead, there was agitation more for voter identification laws and stricter registration requirements and things like that. But now that it appears that vote by mail is going to be an inevitable part of a safety program to make sure that people can vote safely in November, we're starting to see Trump and Ronna McDaniel, who's the head of the RNC, and some others making the claim that vote by mail cannot be trusted. And so just to go back a slide, what if Trump at first appears to win election, but as more votes are counted, Democrats take the lead? This is really a huge concern now because both Pennsylvania and Michigan, which were key swing states in 2016, have changed, this is before COVID-19, have changed to allowing anyone who wants to vote by mail to do so without an excuse. The kind of system we have in California, the kind of system they have in 2/3 of states, it used to be you'd need an excuse. The amount of vote by mail that is likely to come in thanks to the pandemic is going to just overwhelm election officials in both of these states, both Pennsylvania and in Michigan. And it could be days before all of the votes are counted. It's a very close vote. You can imagine a situation, for example, where Trump is ahead on election day. As more ballots are counted, especially from big cities, Biden becomes the winner. Both parties claim that they are entitled to the electoral college votes there. And there could even be a fight over competing slates of electors sent to Congress for counting for electoral college purposes. And I can talk more about that in the Q&A if you're interested. Another concern is about the potential disenfranchisement of voters. We saw this in the recent Wisconsin primary, where voters were unable to vote. There was so much volume of requests for absentee ballots. Some voters didn't get absentee ballots in time. There was a fight to extend those deadlines that went all the way to the US Supreme Court. The deadlines were only partially extended. In Milwaukee, 175 out of 180 polling places for in-person voting were closed down. People who went to vote were fearful that they could contract coronavirus. And so there's real potential for disenfranchisement of voters, which itself can cause people to believe that the election was not fairly run. And of course, there's lots of misinformation potential, like we saw the dirty tricks in 2016, but this could be related to the virus and voting. For example, there could be information sent that's false over social media about postponing the vote or changing voting places. And it's going to be very hard for some voters to figure out what's actually going on. So what do we do about all this? And this is where I'll be the last part of my talk before we open it up for questions in about 5 minutes. First, short-term solutions. The kinds of solutions that I proposed in Election Meltdown, none of them seemed really satisfactory given the fact that we're really highly polarized and there's so much misinformation floating out there. Are we going to be able to rely on the courts? Are the courts going to be able to resolve this? Well, I think even the courts are now seen as much more divided and partisan. You can look at the United States Supreme Court's decision on extending the deadlines in the Wisconsin voting case, where the court divided 5-4. All of the conservatives appointed by Republican presidents sided with the Republican National Committee. All the liberals on the court appointed by Democratic presidents sided with the Democratic National Committee. So would relying on the courts keep things so that people would be confident if they're on the losing side? Not clear. Are there a group of elders who we could rely on? Would people listen to those elders and say, you know, now we need to accept the election results and move on? It seems in this polarized atmosphere, it's hard to imagine that. Would people simply take to the streets? And I should say that since I wrote this book, I've convened a group of people who, experts in the fields of law, politics, media, and tech to come up with some specific suggestions for what we could do to minimize the chance of a meltdown in November. And we're going to be releasing our report about what to do on Tuesday, the 28th. I'm more optimistic about medium or long-term solutions. On voter suppression, I think there needs to be more litigation to prevent these measures from going forward without the evidence that they're needed. The idea should be that all eligible voters and only eligible voters should be able to cast a ballot, which can be fairly and accurately counted. We need more money, more resources. We need more oversight. Brenda Snipes, the Democratic official who was in charge of voting in Broward County, she was repeatedly reelected for office. That shouldn't happen. She should be challenged if she's not competent. Even if a Democrat's going to win, she should face a primary. On dirty tricks, I think we need to think about legislation to deal with misinformation. We need good law enforcement. I think we need to limit the ability to collect unlimited number of absentee ballots. We need subsidies for investigative media to look into these kinds of activities where ballots are tampered with. And we need to pressure social media companies not to allow greater spread of misinformation. And on the rhetoric, I think what helps is fixing these other things. The less incompetence there is, the harder it is for the rhetoric to catch on. I think we need more bipartisan cooperation on election norms and work to try to establish that when there is a fair election that's conducted, the loser should accept those results as legitimate. And finally, long-term solutions. These are the kind of things I think about over the long term, maybe say over the next 20 years. I'd like to see the United States join other advanced democracies in having nonpartisan professionalized election administration. The stress would be on uniformity, transparency, and fairness. The stress would be on voter competence. It's not only about election administrators doing a good job, it's about voters getting accurate information. And finally, civics education about the importance of the rule of law and of peaceful transitions of power. I didn't think back in 2009, when Bush handed power over to Obama, that this would be a major issue for us, but it is. We need to educate both young people today as well as older people that part of the rule of law means that losers accept election results when there's a fair election and agree to try to win the next fair election. In this hyperpolarized atmosphere, which is only exacerbated by the pandemic, I'm not so optimistic that we're going to be able to deal with this in the short term, but I do hope that in the long term, when we get to a moment when we're out of crisis, we will be able to turn towards the importance of education about these kinds of issues so people understand that our democracy is not one that we can take for granted. And on that, I'm going to see if I can stop sharing my slides and turn it over for questions.